You've felt it before. That moment when you think of someone and your phone rings. When you're standing at a crossroads in your life, lost, not knowing which way to turn, and a stranger says exactly the words you needed to hear. When a book falls open to the right page. When a dream shows you something. That happens 3 days later. You called it a coincidence. You moved on. But somewhere, quietly, a part of you didn't believe that. A part of you felt that something was trying to reach you. That the world wasn't just indifferent noise, moving around you without direction or meaning. That there was a pattern just beneath the surface of things. You weren't wrong. Carl Jung spent decades studying these moments, not as curiosities, not as accidents, but as a fundamental feature of reality itself. He called it synchronicity, and what he found changes everything about how you understand your own life, every loss, every encounter, every door that opened at exactly the right time, or closed. Let's start with what synchronicity is not. It is not magic, in the way people use that word to dismiss things they don't understand. It is not superstition. It is not wishful thinking dressed up in spiritual language. Jung was a scientist, a psychiatrist who spent his entire career inside the human mind, mapping its structures, its depths, its hidden architecture. He wasn't a mystic who wanted the world to be meaningful. He was a rigorous thinker who kept encountering something he couldn't explain away. And that tension between the scientific mind and the inexplicable experience is exactly where synchronicity was born. It started, as so many things in Jung's work did, with a patient. A woman came to him for therapy, highly intelligent, analytically sharp, deeply resistant to change. She had built a worldview so rational, so perfectly sealed, that nothing could penetrate it. Not emotion, not intuition, not the parts of herself she had carefully locked away and refused to examine. Jung felt the therapy was stuck. She could talk about her problems endlessly, fluently, intelligently. But the talking wasn't reaching anything real. It was circling the surface of something without ever breaking through. Then, one afternoon, she told him about a dream she'd had the night before. In the dream, someone had given her a golden scarab, a jewel in the form of a scarab beetle. As she was describing the dream, Jung heard a tapping at the window behind him. He turned. There, on the glass, was an insect trying to get in. He opened the window and caught it in his hand. It was a rose chafer, the closest thing in that region of Europe to a scarab beetle. He handed it to her and said, "Here is your scarab." Something broke open in her that day. The therapy moved, something that no amount of rational conversation had been able to touch was reached by that single, impossible moment. Jung didn't know what to do with this. Not at first. He had been trained to explain things, cause and effect, action and reaction. The orderly machinery of the material world moving forward in predictable sequence. But this moment, and dozens like it that he had collected over the years, didn't fit that machinery. There was no causal connection between the woman's dream and the beetle at the window. No mechanism, no chain of events linking the two. No explanation that the rational mind could accept without remainder. And yet, the meaning was undeniable. The timing was undeniable. The precision with which that moment arrived, exactly as it was needed, exactly as the image from her dream was still alive in the room. That precision demanded something more than coincidence, So Jung did what honest thinkers do when reality refuses to cooperate with their theories. He didn't dismiss what he had seen. He didn't file it away as an anomaly and move on. He built a new framework to hold it. He spent years developing the concept, corresponding with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, who had his own reasons to believe that the boundary between mind and matter was far less solid than science had assumed. What they arrived at together was this: there is a principle operating in reality that is not governed by cause and effect, a principle that connects events not through physical chains of action, but through meaning. Two things happen at the same time. They have no causal relationship, but they share a meaning so precise, so personal, so impossible to dismiss, that coincidence becomes an inadequate word. That is synchronicity. Not everything that happens to you is synchronicity. Jung was careful about this. A bus arriving on time is not the universe speaking to you. Losing your keys is probably just losing your keys. But you know the difference, don't you? You've had moments that felt different. Moments where the precision of the timing, the specificity of what appeared, the way it landed exactly where you were, most raw, most open, most lost, couldn't be measured by probability, couldn't be filed away as random, couldn't quite be explained no matter how many times you tried. Those moments are what we're here to talk about. And the first thing you need to understand is that Jung didn't ask you to believe in them blindly. He asked you to look at them honestly. Because the problem isn't that these moments are hard to explain. The problem is that most people have been trained quietly and thoroughly to distrust exactly the kind of knowing that synchronicity requires. The knowing that isn't logical. The knowing that arrives before the explanation. The knowing that lives in the body before it reaches the mind. You felt something, and then you talked yourself out of it. You've done this so many times that you might not even notice you're doing it anymore. There's a question that comes up almost immediately when people encounter this idea. And it's a fair question. It deserves a real answer. The question is, how do you know? How do you know the difference between a genuine synchronicity and your mind doing what minds do, finding patterns, constructing meaning, seeing faces in clouds? The human brain is a meaning-making machine. It was built for this. It finds patterns even where none exist, connects dots that may have no real relationship, fills silence with narrative. So how do you trust what you feel when you know your feelings can deceive you? This is actually the most important question you can ask, not because it disproves synchronicity, but because asking it honestly is the only way to take it seriously. Jung didn't ignore this problem, he wrestled with it. And what he arrived at wasn't a formula. It wasn't a checklist you could run through to certify whether a moment counted or not. What he described was something more like a quality of experience. A synchronistic event, he said, carries a particular kind of charge. Not excitement exactly. Not the warm feeling of something confirming what you already wanted to believe. Something quieter than that, and heavier. A sense of recognition. As if something that was always true had just become visible. You've felt the difference between the two, haven't you? The difference between noticing something and wanting it to mean something, and noticing something that already means something before you've had time to decide how you feel about it. The first is wishful thinking. The second is something else. The second arrives without your permission, and that distinction matters more than any external criteria you could apply. Because synchronicity, by its nature, is personal. It speaks in a language built from your specific life, your specific wounds, your specific questions. A scarab beetle means nothing to most people. To that woman, in that moment, in that room, it was the precise image her psyche had chosen to signal that something needed to change. The universe, if we can call it that, doesn't broadcast on a general frequency. It speaks in your vocabulary, which means that no one else can fully validate what you experienced. And no one else can fully invalidate it either. What you can do is learn to tell the difference between the moments that arrive with wait and the moments that arrive with want. Wait feels different from want. Wait doesn't need you to agree with it. It simply is now. There's something else Jung noticed about when synchronicities tend to appear. They don't arrive randomly, scattered evenly across the texture of a life. They cluster. They cluster around thresholds, around the moments when something in you is shifting, when an old structure is breaking down, when a decision can no longer be postponed, when grief has finally reached the place where it becomes something else. They appear at the edges of transformation. Think about your own life. Think about the synchronicities you remember most clearly, the ones you still carry years later. Were they random Tuesday afternoons? Or were they moments when you were already, in some way, in motion? Already standing at a door, even if you hadn't yet decided to open it? This is not coincidence within the concept of synchronicity. This is central to it. Jung believed that synchronicity was connected to what he called the self, the deeper organizing principle of the psyche, the part of you that is oriented toward wholeness, even when the conscious mind is oriented toward comfort or avoidance or survival. The self doesn't speak in words. It speaks in images, in dreams, in the sudden appearance of exactly the right person at exactly the wrong time. It speaks in the language of events, and it tends to speak most clearly when the conscious mind has run out of answers, when you've exhausted logic, when the plans have failed, when the version of yourself you've been maintaining can no longer hold its shape. That is when the deeper intelligence of your own life begins to communicate through the world around you. Not to comfort you, not to give you easy answers, but to point, to indicate a direction your conscious mind hadn't considered, or had refused to consider, or hadn't had the courage to look at directly. Synchronicity, at its deepest level, is the psyche's way of insisting that you are not as lost as you think you are. That something in you knows the way, even when you don't. Let's talk about the ancient world for a moment. Because Jung didn't invent this. He named it, he mapped it, he gave it a framework that a modern mind could hold. But the experience itself is as old as human consciousness. Every major civilization that left records behind had a word for it, a practice built around it, a cosmology that assumed it. The ancients didn't experience the world as a collection of separate, unrelated events moving through empty time. They experienced it as alive, as a fabric in which everything was connected, not by physical chains you could trace with your hands, but by invisible correspondences, by sympathies between things that shared a common nature, by a deep structural order that ran beneath the surface of appearances. The Hermetic tradition, one of the oldest philosophical lineages in the Western world, built its entire worldview on a single principle: as above, so below. What happens in the heavens is reflected on Earth. What happens in the outer world is reflected in the inner world. The macrocosm and the microcosm are not separate systems. They are the same system, seen from different scales. This wasn't poetry to them. It was a description of how reality actually operates. The movements of planets were not just astronomical events. They were meaningful events, carrying information about cycles and forces that also moved through human lives. A healer reading the body was reading the same text as an astronomer reading the sky. Different language. Same book. The Chinese tradition had its own version of this. The I Ching, the Book of Changes, one of the oldest texts in human history, is built entirely on the premise that a moment in time has a quality, a specific character that expresses itself simultaneously across all levels of reality. When you throw coins or yarrow stalks to consult the I Ching, you are not asking a magic tool to predict your future. You are asking, what is the nature of this moment? What pattern is moving through reality right now? And how does that pattern speak to the question I'm carrying? Jung was fascinated by the I Ching. He wrote the foreword to one of its most important Western translations. He saw it as a 4,000-year-old technology for engaging consciously with synchronicity, for creating conditions in which the meaningful coincidence could speak more clearly. And then there were the Greeks, who built temples at specific locations on the earth because those locations were understood to be thin places, places where the boundary between the visible and invisible worlds was more permeable than elsewhere, who sent their most important questions to Delphi, not because they believed a woman sitting on a rock had access to literal future facts, but because they understood that certain states of consciousness, certain ritual conditions, could open a channel between the questioning mind and the deeper order of things. The oracle didn't predict. The oracle pointed. Different cultures, different languages, different cosmologies, but the same underlying assumption: that reality is not indifferent, that the world is not a machine running without awareness of the lives moving through it. That meaning is not something the human mind imposes on a meaningless universe, but something the universe is already saturated with, waiting to be recognized. Jung didn't arrive at synchronicity by reading these traditions. Exactly. He arrived at it through his clinical work, through decades of sitting with human beings in the depths of their suffering and their transformation. But when he looked up from his notebooks and looked at what the ancients had been saying for thousands of years, he found the same map, different symbols, different vocabulary, the same territory. And that convergence matters, because it means this is not a modern idea that will be replaced by the next intellectual fashion. It is something that human beings have been encountering consistently across every culture, across every era, for as long as there have been human beings. Something that refuses to go away no matter how many times the rational mind tries to explain it into silence. The ancients called it different things: fate, providence, the Tao, the will of the gods. Jung called it synchronicity. The name is less important than the recognition. The recognition that you are not moving through an empty world, that the world has been moving with you all along. There's something that happens to people when they first really take synchronicity seriously. Not intellectually seriously, not "That's an interesting idea seriously, but personally seriously." When they go back through their own life and begin looking at it through this lens, something shifts. And it's not always comfortable, because when you start to see the pattern, when you start to recognize the moments that were pointing somewhere and trace where they were pointing, you also see the moments you ignored, the door you didn't walk through, the person you dismissed too quickly, the feeling you overrode because it wasn't convenient, because it didn't fit the plan, because you were afraid of what following it would cost you. And there's a particular kind of grief in that. Not dramatic grief, quiet grief. The grief of recognizing that life was trying to speak to you before you knew how to listen. I want you to sit with that for a moment, not to punish yourself with it, but because that recognition is itself a threshold. The moment you see it clearly is the moment you stop sleepwalking through your own story. Now, let's talk about what actually makes a synchronicity meaningful, because this is where most explanations stop too soon. People hear the concept and they reduce it to coincidence with feeling. Something strange happened and it felt significant. But Jung was pointing at something more specific than that. He wasn't just talking about moments that feel meaningful. He was talking about moments that function meaningfully, moments that do something, that move something in you that needed to move, that answer something you were genuinely asking, even if you were asking it in silence, even if you hadn't fully formed the question yet. This is the part that takes time to understand. Synchronicity is not decoration. It is not the universe sending you pleasant confirmations that you're on the right track. Sometimes it is, but just as often, it arrives as disruption, as the thing that breaks the plan you were so certain about, as the encounter that makes you question everything you thought you knew, as the loss that opens a door you never would have opened voluntarily. The woman with the scarab didn't have a comfortable experience. Something broke open in her. That's not comfortable, that's necessary. And this distinction matters enormously because it separates synchronicity from wishful thinking more clearly than anything else. Wishful thinking always confirms what you want. Synchronicity confirms what you need, and what you need is not always what you would have chosen. There's a word Jung used for this process, the process of being gradually shaped, gradually redirected, gradually broken open and rebuilt by the deeper intelligence of your own life. He called it individuation, and synchronicity in his framework is one of the primary instruments of individuation. The self uses the world. It uses the timing of events, the appearance of certain people, the closing of certain doors, the opening of others, to move you toward wholeness in ways your conscious mind would never have planned and might never have agreed to. Think about the people who changed your life most significantly. How many of them did you meet through careful planning? How many arrived through a chain of events so unlikely that any single link breaking would have meant you never crossed paths? Think about the turning points, the moments that divided your life into before and after. How many of those were chosen? How many simply happened? And then, looking back, how many of them turned out to be exactly what was needed? Even the ones that felt like devastation at the time. Especially the ones that felt like devastation at the time. This is what it looks like when the deeper order of a life is operating. Not smooth, not comfortable, not according to plan, but coherent. coherent in a way that only becomes visible in retrospect when you're far enough from the event to see the shape it was part of. That coherence is not random, and the question synchronicity asks you to sit with is not whether you believe in it intellectually. The question is simpler than that, and harder. What if your life has been trying to take you somewhere the whole time? What if the losses, the detours, the impossible coincidences, the doors that closed without explanation, and the ones that opened without reason? What if none of that was noise? What if all of it was signal? There's a practice that comes out of all of this, and I want to be careful about how I introduce it, because the word practice can make it sound like a technique, like something you add to your morning routine between the meditation app and the gratitude journal. It's not that. It's something quieter, and it asks more of you than a technique does. What Jung suggested and what the contemplative traditions before him suggested is simply this: pay attention differently, not more. Not with more effort or more vigilance or more analysis, differently. Most of us move through our days in a state of managed inattention. We are technically present, our eyes are open, our bodies are functioning, we are responding to what's in front of us. But there is a layer of experience we have learned to filter out, the layer that doesn't fit the agenda. The layer that doesn't serve the task at hand. The layer that arrives sideways, in images and feelings and sudden inexplicable impulses that the rational mind has no category for. We filter it out not because it isn't real, but because we were never taught to work with it. Because the world we grew up in rewarded a very specific kind of attention, the kind that is linear, goal-directed, productive, the kind that moves efficiently from problem to solution without getting distracted by things it can't immediately use. That kind of attention is valuable. It built everything you can see from where you're sitting. But it is partial. It sees one layer of reality clearly and is effectively blind to everything else. Synchronicity lives in everything else. So what does it mean to pay attention differently? It means, first, slowing down enough to notice what you're noticing, not just what you're thinking, what you're noticing, the image that catches your eye for no clear reason, the phrase from a conversation that stays with you longer than it should, the sudden memory that surfaces in the middle of an unrelated task, the feeling, arriving without explanation, that something is about to change. These are not distractions. They may be exactly the signal you've been filtering out for years. It means, second, keeping some kind of record. Jung kept a journal, not a diary of events, but a record of inner experience, dreams, images, feelings, the moments that carried unusual weight. When you write these things down, you do two things simultaneously. You tell your own psyche that you are paying attention, and you create a surface on which patterns can become visible that would otherwise disappear into the noise of daily life. A synchronicity you don't record is a synchronicity you will almost certainly forget. And forgotten synchronicities cannot show you their pattern. It is the pattern that carries the meaning, not the individual event. A single unusual coincidence is curious. 3 unusual coincidences, all pointing in the same direction, over the course of 6 months. That is a conversation. And the third thing it means is developing what we might call a tolerance for not knowing. Because synchronicity doesn't explain itself. It arrives, it points, and then it waits. It does not provide a map with a clear route marked in red. It provides a single footprint and trusts that you are capable of following it. Most people are not comfortable with this. We want the full picture. We want to know where we're going before we take the step. We want the meaning delivered clearly, preferably with instructions. But that is not how this works. Following synchronicity requires a particular kind of courage. The courage to act on partial information, to trust the direction without seeing the destination, to take the step that feels true before you can prove that it is. The ancients called this faith, though not in the religious sense the word has acquired. Faith in the older sense. Fidelity. Faithfulness to what you have genuinely perceived, even when the rational mind is generating 100 reasons to dismiss it. This is perhaps the most demanding thing synchronicity asks of you. Not belief, not the suspension of critical thinking, but the willingness to take seriously what you have actually experienced rather than what you have been told is possible. You have been told in 1,000 quiet ways that the world is indifferent. That meaning is something you manufacture, that the feeling of being guided is a cognitive bias with a Latin name. And maybe some of that is true some of the time. But you have also had moments you still remember, moments that arrived with a weight and a precision that no theory of randomness has ever fully explained to you. Those moments were real. They were trying to tell you something. And the question that remains, the question this entire conversation has been building toward, is whether you are willing now to start listening. Before we go further, I want to pause here for a moment. If you've stayed with this conversation this long, you're not someone who watches videos passively. You're someone who is genuinely looking for something. And I want to acknowledge that. This channel exists for exactly that person. Not for people who want easy answers or comfortable confirmations of what they already believe. For people who are willing to sit with difficult questions and follow them somewhere real. If that's you, subscribe to Myth and Mirror. Not because it helps the algorithm, though it does, but because what we're building here is a body of work, a sustained exploration of the ideas that actually matter. Jung, the ancient traditions, the deep structures of the psyche, the things that were true before anyone gave them a name. Every video goes deeper. Every video assumes you're ready for more. And if you've made it here, you are. There's one more dimension of synchronicity we haven't touched yet, and it may be the most important one. Everything we've discussed so far has been, in a sense, receptive. How to notice, how to listen, how to recognize the signal in the noise. But there is another side to this, one that the Hermetic tradition understood very clearly and that Jung arrived at through a different door. It is this: consciousness participates in what it observes. This is not mysticism. This is, at this point, physics. The observer effect in quantum mechanics, the finding that the act of measurement changes what is being measured, was one of the things that drew Wolfgang Pauli to his long correspondence with Jung. Because if consciousness is not a passive receiver of reality, if it is in some sense a participant in the shaping of reality, then synchronicity is not just something that happens to you. It is something you are in some way in conversation with. Think about what changes when you begin paying attention. Not just what you notice, but what seems to arrive. People who begin working seriously with dreams report that their dreams become more vivid, more coherent, more communicative. Not because the unconscious suddenly decided to cooperate, but because the act of attention itself signals to the deeper layers of the psyche that the channel is open, that someone is listening. The same principle operates with synchronicity. When you begin to take these moments seriously, when you stop dismissing them and start sitting with them, something shifts in the quality of your experience, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, over weeks and months. The moments seem to arrive more frequently, more precisely, more impossible to ignore. Is this because the universe is responding to your attention? Or because your attention has become refined enough to perceive what was always there? Jung would say, that distinction may not be as meaningful as it seems, because at the level where synchronicity operates, the boundary between inside and outside, between psyche and world, between the observer and the observed, is not fixed. This was the deepest thing he found, the thing that took him decades to say out loud because he knew how it would sound, that the psyche is not sealed inside the skull, that the self, the deepest organizing principle of a human life, extends somehow into the world, that it is capable of arranging or recognizing or participating in arrangements, that the conscious mind experiences as coming from outside. He called this the unus mundus, the one world, the underlying unity from which both psyche and matter arise. And synchronicity, in his final understanding, was not a strange exception to the rules of reality. It was a glimpse of the rules themselves, a momentary transparency in the fabric through which you could see that the separation you take for granted, the separation between self and world, between inner and outer, between what you are and what surrounds you, is not the final truth. It is a useful fiction, a necessary simplification, but not the whole picture. You have felt this, in those moments, the ones you still carry, the moment when the boundary dissolved, just briefly, and something moved through both worlds at once, and left a mark on both sides. That was not your imagination. That was reality showing you its actual structure. We started with a phone that rang at exactly the moment you were thinking of someone. A stranger who said the words you needed. A book that fell open to the right page. You called it coincidence. You moved on. But something in you didn't. Something in you kept those moments. Filed them somewhere that isn't quite memory and isn't quite belief. Somewhere between the two. That place where you keep things you don't know what to do with but can't bring yourself to discard. I want to tell you something about that place. It is not a place of confusion. It is a place of knowing. Knowing that arrived before you had the framework to hold it. Knowing that your rational mind couldn't confirm, but your deeper self refused to release. You have been carrying evidence. For years, possibly. Evidence of a reality that is more structured than it appears, more attentive than it pretends, more intimately connected to the specific texture of your life than any theory of randomness can account for. Jung spent 40 years building a framework precise enough to hold what you already knew. The ancients spent thousands of years mapping the same territory from different directions, and all of them arrived at the same place. Not at certainty. Certainty was never the point. At something more valuable than certainty. At orientation. The sense that you are not moving through an indifferent universe in which your life is an accident and your suffering is noise. The sense that something is present in the fabric of things, something that is not indifferent to you, something that speaks in the precise language of your own life when you are ready enough, or broken enough, or quiet enough to hear it. This doesn't mean everything happens for a reason in the simple, comfortable way that phrase is usually meant. It doesn't mean the losses weren't real. It doesn't mean the pain was necessary in a way that justifies it. It means something harder than that, and more useful. It means that even inside the loss, even inside the confusion, even inside the long stretches where nothing seemed to be moving, something was. Something was arranging. Something was pointing. Something was waiting for you to be ready to receive what it had been trying to deliver. You don't have to believe this. Belief was never what this required. What it requires is simpler. Look back. Take 1 hour, one afternoon, and look back at the moments you've been carrying. The ones that never quite resolved into coincidence, no matter how many times you tried to file them there. Trace them. See where they were pointing. See what they had in common. See what question they were all, in their different ways, trying to answer. And then ask yourself, honestly, whether the life that resulted from following those moments or from ignoring them has been moving toward something or away from it. That is the only proof synchronicity offers. And it is the only proof it needs to offer, because it is your proof, built from your life, impossible to dismiss and impossible to transfer. The universe doesn't argue its case in general terms. It argues it in the specific, unrepeatable details of a single human existence. Yours. Take that seriously. Not because someone told you to, not because a framework demands it, but because you have felt it. And what you have felt is real. If this conversation opens something in you, share it with 5 people who are ready to hear it. Not people who will be polite about it, people who will sit with it. Subscribe to Myth and Mirror, not for the videos, for the ongoing work of becoming someone who can see their own life clearly. And leave a comment. Not great video. Tell me about a synchronicity you've been carrying, one you've never quite been able to explain away. Or tell me what you want to go deeper into next. What question is alive in you right now that you haven't found a real answer to yet? I'll be here.